The dust on Grace Reeves' hands had turned to mud from her own desperate tears. When she finally gathered enough courage to approach the tall cowboy standing outside the largest stable in Fort Lyon, Colorado. It was August of 1878, and the unforgiving sun beat down on her threadbare dress as she wiped her face quickly, trying to compose herself before he noticed her standing there like some pathetic waif. "Mister, please," Grace called out, her voice cracking despite her best efforts to sound strong. "I can work. I am not afraid of hard labor. I will clean your stables, muck out the stalls, anything you need. I just need a little food and maybe a corner somewhere to sleep." The cowboy turned around, and Grace found herself looking up at a man who appeared to be in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most. His dark hair curled slightly beneath his worn hat, and his eyes were the color of rich earth after a rain. Those eyes studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she held his gaze, trying to show him she was serious, that she was not just some beggar looking for charity. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice deeper than she had expected but not unkind. "Grace Reeves, sir." "I am 19 years old and I am a hard worker. I promise you would not regret giving me a chance." The cowboy removed his hat, running a hand through his hair as he looked her over again. Grace knew what he saw. A young woman who had not eaten a proper meal in days, whose dress was little more than rags, whose boots had holes that let in every rock and pebble on the road. She had walked for 3 days to reach Fort Lyon after the family she had been working for back in Kansas decided they could no longer afford to keep her on. They had given her $2 and told her to find her way to relatives. The problem was, Grace had no relatives. Not anymore. The cholera outbreak of 1873 had taken her parents and her younger brother, leaving her alone at 14 to make her way in an unforgiving world. "My name is James Morrison," the cowboy said finally. "I own this ranch, and I've got plenty of work that needs doing. But I've got to ask you straight, Miss Reeves. Are you running from something, a husband? The law?" "No, sir," Grace said quickly. "I have no husband, and I have never done anything to run afoul of the law. I am just alone in this world and trying to survive the best way I know how." James studied her face for a long moment, and Grace felt her cheeks warm under his scrutiny. Finally, he nodded and placed his hat back on his head. "All right then, but you are not sleeping in any stable or barn. I have got a house with more rooms than I know what to do with, and you will take one of those. We will figure out your wages once I see what kind of worker you are." "Fair enough." Grace felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. "More than fair, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much." "Come on then," James said, gesturing for her to follow him. "Let me show you where you will be staying, and then we will get some food in you. You look like you are about to fall over." Grace followed James across the dusty yard, past corrals filled with beautiful horses, past a large barn that looked sturdy and well-maintained. Everything about his ranch spoke of a man who took pride in his work and had the means to do things right. The house itself was a substantial 2-story structure painted white with a wraparound porch that provided shade from the relentless Colorado sun. Inside, the house was even more impressive. The furniture was solid and well-made, the floors were clean and curtains hung in the windows. It was clear that someone had once cared deeply about making this house a home, though Grace noticed there were no feminine touches, no flowers or delicate things that women often like to have around. "This way," James said, leading her up a staircase to the second floor. He walked past several closed doors and then stopped in front of one at the end of the hall. When he opened it, Grace gasped. The room was enormous, with a large bed covered in a beautiful quilt, a wardrobe that looked like it was made of cherry wood, a washstand with a porcelain basin and pitcher, and windows that let in plenty of light. It was the finest room Grace had ever seen, let alone been offered to stay in. "Sir, I cannot possibly stay in a room like this," Grace protested. "This is too fine. I am just here to work in the stables. A small room would be more than sufficient." "This is the master bedroom," James said quietly. "It has not been used in over 2 years, and I see no reason for it to sit empty when someone could be getting good use out of it. I sleep in a room downstairs. It suits me fine, and I would prefer knowing this space is not going to waste." "But Sir James," he interrupted. "Call me James. And this is not up for debate, Miss Reeves. You will stay here, and that is final. Now, I am going to give you some time to wash up and rest if you need it. Come down when you are ready, and I will have something for you to eat." Before Grace could protest further, James left the room, closing the door behind him. She stood there in stunned silence, looking around at the beautiful space she had been given. Slowly, she walked to the bed and sat down on its edge, feeling the soft mattress beneath her. It had been so long since she had slept on anything other than a thin pallet or the hard ground that she had almost forgotten what comfort felt like. Grace allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to sit and absorb the incredible turn her fortunes had taken. Then she stood and went to the washstand, pouring water from the pitcher into the basin. She washed her face and hands, scrubbing away days of travel dirt until her skin felt raw but clean. She wished she had another dress to change into, but this ragged one was all she possessed. She did her best to shake the dust from it and smooth her dark blonde hair back into a more presentable bun. When Grace finally made her way downstairs, she found James in the kitchen. He had set out bread, cheese, cold meat, and what looked like apple pie on the table. The sight of so much food made her stomach clench with hunger, but she forced herself to approach slowly, maintaining what dignity she had left. "Sit down and eat," James said, not looking at her as he poured coffee into 2 cups. "You do not need to be shy about it. I know you are hungry." Grace sat and picked up a piece of bread, forcing herself to take small bites even though she wanted to devour everything in front of her. James sat down across from her with his own coffee and watched her eat with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you," Grace said after she had eaten enough to take the edge off her hunger. "I promise I will work hard to repay your kindness." "Tell me about yourself," James said. "How did you end up alone and walking to Fort Lyon?" Grace set down her bread and met his eyes. "My parents and brother died 5 years ago during a cholera outbreak in Missouri. I was 14. A family in our town took me in and let me work for my keep. They were kind enough, but when their own circumstances became difficult this summer, they could not afford to keep me anymore. They suggested I try to find work in a bigger town, so I started walking. Fort Lyon was the first place I reached that looked like it might have opportunities. No other family, no aunts or uncles or cousins." Grace shook her head. "No one. My mother was an only child, and my father's family was back in Pennsylvania. We lost touch with them years before the outbreak." James was quiet for a moment, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup. "I am sorry you have had such a hard time of it." "That is too much for anyone to bear, especially someone so young." "We all have our burdens to carry," Grace said softly. "I imagine you have had your share as well." Something flickered across James's face, a pain that was quickly hidden. "This house was built for my wife," he said after a long pause. "We married young, and I wanted to give her the finest home I could manage. She loved it here for the 2 years we had together. Then she got sick, and there was not a damn thing I could do to save her. She died in that room upstairs, the one I just gave you." Grace felt her heart squeeze with sympathy. "I am so sorry. If you would rather I stay somewhere else." "No," James said firmly. "Sarah would not want that room sitting empty and unused. She was practical that way." She would have liked knowing someone was getting comfort from it. Besides, I think she would have approved of me helping someone who needed it. She had a soft heart for people down on their luck. She sounds like she was a wonderful woman. She was, James agreed. But she is gone, and I have learned that life keeps moving forward whether we are ready for it or not. Now, if you are finished eating, I will show you around the ranch and explain what I need help with. We can start your actual work tomorrow after you have had a chance to properly rest. Grace stood, feeling more steady now that she had food in her stomach. I would prefer to start today if that is acceptable. I do not want you to think I am lazy or taking advantage of your generosity. A small smile crossed James's face, the first she had seen from him. It transformed his features, making him look younger and far less burdened. I can see you are not the type to sit idle. All right then, let me show you around. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of information as James showed Grace every aspect of his ranch. He owned 40 horses, a mixture of working ranch horses and breeding stock that he sold to other ranchers and the occasional cavalry buyer. He also kept a small herd of cattle, more for his own use than for profit, and chickens for eggs and meat. He employed 2 other men who worked the ranch, a grizzled older cowboy named Pete, who handled most of the cattle work, and a younger man named Tommy, who helped with the horses and general maintenance. Both men lived in a bunkhouse on the far side of the property. The stables were impressive, with 12 stalls and a tack room that was meticulously organized. This was clearly where James spent most of his time and where his heart lay. He spoke about each horse by name, telling her their personalities and quirks, which ones were gentle and which ones needed a firm hand. I mucked out the stalls this morning, James explained, but it needs doing twice a day, morning and evening. The horses also need to be fed and watered twice daily, and their hooves should be checked regular for stones or injury. Can you handle that? Yes, Grace said without hesitation. I grew up around horses. My father worked on a farm before he got sick, and I spent plenty of time in the stables. I know my way around them. Good. There is also general cleaning to be done around the property, and if you know how to cook, I would not say no to some decent meals. I can manage basic things, but I am the first to admit my cooking leaves a lot to be desired. I can cook, Grace assured him. The family I worked for, the wife taught me quite a bit. I may not be fancy, but I can make filling, tasty food. That is more than enough, James said. Now it is getting late. Why do not you head back to the house and get some rest? Tomorrow will be a full day. Grace wanted to protest, to insist she could do more, but exhaustion was starting to catch up with her. The combination of days of travel, emotional strain, and finally feeling safe was making her eyes heavy. She nodded and made her way back to the house, climbing the stairs to that beautiful room that still did not feel quite real. That night, Grace lay in the comfortable bed and stared up at the ceiling, hardly able to believe how much her life had changed in the course of a single day. She had been prepared to sleep in a stable, grateful for any shelter at all, and instead she was in the finest room she had ever seen, with a full stomach and the promise of steady work. More than that, there was something about James Morrison that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt in a very long time. He was clearly a good man, the kind who would offer help to someone in need without expecting anything improper in return. As Grace drifted off to sleep, she sent up a quiet prayer of thanks and hoped that she could prove herself worthy of the chance he had given her. The next morning, Grace woke before dawn, a habit ingrained from years of hard work. She dressed in the same threadbare dress, wishing again that she had something better to wear, and made her way downstairs. James was already in the kitchen, pulling on his boots. "Good morning," he said, looking surprised to see her up so early. I figured you would sleep a bit longer after yesterday. I am used to early mornings, Grace said. If you point me toward the stables, I will get started on mucking out the stalls. Have some coffee and breakfast first, James said. We have got time. Grace helped herself to coffee and found eggs and bacon warming on the stove. She ate quickly, aware that James was already dressed and ready to start his day. When they walked out to the stables together, the sun was just starting to paint the eastern sky with streaks of pink and gold. James showed Grace where everything was kept, the shovels and rakes, the wheelbarrow, where to dump the soiled bedding and where to get fresh straw. Then he left her to her work, heading off to check on the horses in the outer corrals. Grace threw herself into the work with determination. Mucking stalls was hard, physical labor, but she did not mind. There was something satisfying about the simple, straightforward nature of it. Each stall she cleaned was one task completed, one small proof of her worth. By the time the sun was fully up, she had finished half the stalls and was covered in sweat and bits of straw. "You work fast," James's voice came from behind her, making her jump slightly. "And thorough. That is good work, Grace." The sound of her name on his lips without the formal Miss Reeves made something flutter in her chest. She turned to face him, pushing a strand of hair that had escaped her bun away from her face. "Thank you. I want to do a good job." "You are," he assured her. "Take a break and get some water. It is already getting hot, and I do not need you collapsing from heat exhaustion on your first full day." Grace wanted to argue that she was fine, but she was thirsty, and the heat was indeed becoming oppressive. She followed James back to the house, where he poured her a large glass of water and made her drink all of it before allowing her to return to work. The days began to fall into a pattern. Grace would wake early and muck out the stalls, feed and water the horses, and do any other work around the ranch that needed doing. James was always nearby, working alongside her more often than not, and Grace found herself looking forward to their conversations. He told her about the horses, about his plans for the ranch, about growing up in Colorado and how he had built this place from almost nothing. In turn, Grace shared memories of her childhood, the good times before the sickness came, and James listened with genuine interest. A week into her stay, James drove her into Fort Lyon in his wagon. "You need proper work clothes," he said when she tried to protest. "That dress is falling apart and you cannot keep working in it. Consider it part of your wages." At the general store, James insisted on buying her 2 sturdy work dresses, a pair of proper boots, a warm coat for the coming winter, and a few other necessities. Grace felt overwhelmed by his generosity, but when she tried to thank him, he waved her off. "You work hard," he said simply. "You deserve to have clothes that are not falling off your back." As they rode back to the ranch, Grace found herself studying James's profile. He was a handsome man, there was no denying that, with strong features and that thick dark hair that always seemed slightly unruly. But it was more than his looks that drew her attention. It was the kindness he showed her, the respect he gave her despite her circumstances, the way he treated her like a person of value rather than just a desperate girl he had taken pity on. Grace tried to push those thoughts away. James had loved his wife deeply, and he was only being kind because that was the sort of man he was. She was here to work, nothing more. Getting foolish romantic notions would only lead to heartache and possibly cost her the best situation she had ever had. But despite her best intentions, Grace could not stop her heart from beginning to hope for something more. Another week passed, and Grace settled more comfortably into life at the ranch. She had proven herself capable with the horses, and James began teaching her more advanced care, how to treat minor injuries, how to spot signs of illness before they became serious, how to gentle a nervous horse with patience and a soft voice. Grace absorbed everything he taught her, hungry for knowledge and eager to make herself as useful as possible. Pete and Tommy had accepted her presence easily enough. Pete was a man of few words, but he gave her a nod of respect when he saw the quality of her work. Tommy, who was 21 and had a quick smile, was friendlier, often joking with her when their paths crossed. Grace appreciated their acceptance but kept things professional, not wanting to give anyone the wrong impression. It was a Saturday evening, nearly 3 weeks after Grace's arrival, when James came to find her as she was finishing up the evening feeding. "Come up to the house when you are done," he said. "I have got something for you." Curious, Grace finished her work quickly and washed up at the pump before heading inside. She found James in the kitchen, and spread out on the table were bolts of fabric in various colors, sewing notions and paper patterns. "I was talking to Mrs. Patterson at the general store," James explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "She mentioned that you might appreciate some fabric to make yourself some dresses. Proper ones, I mean, not just work clothes. I know I already got you those work dresses, but I figured a young woman probably wants something nice to wear on Sundays or special occasions." Grace stared at the beautiful fabrics, at the deep blue one that would bring out her eyes, at the soft green that reminded her of spring grass, at the practical brown that would be perfect for everyday wear. Her throat grew tight with emotion. "James, this is too much," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have already done so much for me." "It is not too much," James said firmly. "You work harder than anyone I have ever employed, and you have made this place feel more like a home again. Let me do this for you, Grace. Please." Grace looked up at him, at the earnestness in his eyes, and felt something shift in her chest. "Thank you," she managed. "I do not know what to say except thank you." "That is more than enough," James said softly, and for a moment they just stood there, looking at each other, something unspoken hanging in the air between them. The moment was broken when they heard horses approaching outside. James went to the window and looked out, his expression becoming more guarded. "That is John Sullivan and his boys," he said. "Stay inside while I see what they want." Grace watched from the window as James went out to meet 3 men on horseback. The one in front, who must have been John Sullivan, was a large man with a weathered face and an air of arrogance about him. The conversation between him and James seemed tense, though she could not hear what was being said. After a few minutes, Sullivan and his sons rode off and James came back inside looking troubled. "What did they want?" Grace asked. James sighed and sat down heavily at the table. "Sullivan owns the ranch to the west. He has been trying to buy my land for years, and he is not happy that I keep refusing. He heard I hired you and came to warn me about keeping questionable women on my property." Grace felt her face flame with anger and shame. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that who I employ is none of his damn business and that he should get off my land before I helped him leave," James said, his jaw tight. "Grace, I need you to know that I do not care what Sullivan or anyone else thinks. You have earned your place here through hard work and integrity. Do not let small-minded gossip bother you." "I do not want to cause trouble for you," Grace said quietly. "You are not causing trouble. Sullivan is causing trouble because he is a bully who is used to getting his way. Forget about him." But it was hard for Grace to forget. Over the next few days, she became aware of whispers when she accompanied James to town. Women would stop talking when she passed, and men would give her looks that ranged from curious to disapproving. Grace held her head high and tried to ignore it, but it stung nonetheless. One afternoon, as Grace was working in the stable, a woman appeared in the doorway. She was perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed, with kind eyes and a gentle manner. "Hello," the woman said. "You must be Grace Reeves. I am Martha Cunningham. My husband and I own the mercantile in town." Grace straightened, suddenly very aware of how she must look, covered in dust and sweat. "Yes, madam. Can I help you with something?" "I came to meet you properly," Martha said. "I have heard talk, you see, and I wanted to see for myself what kind of young woman has got everyone in town gossiping." Grace felt her defenses rise. "And what have you decided?" Martha smiled warmly. "That you are exactly what you appear to be, a hard-working young woman trying to make an honest living. I also want to let you know that not everyone in Fort Lyon is as small-minded as certain individuals. Some of us think James Morrison is a good man who did a kind thing by giving you work and a proper place to stay. If you ever need anything or just someone to talk to, I hope you will come see me." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Cunningham. That means more than you know. Call me Martha, dear. And think about coming to church on Sunday. It would do people good to see you there, and it might help quiet some of the gossip." After Martha left, Grace thought about her words. She had not been to church since arriving at the ranch, partly because she had been so focused on work and partly because she had been afraid of the reception she might receive. But Martha was right. If she wanted to be accepted in Fort Lyon, she needed to show people she had nothing to hide. That Sunday, Grace put on one of her new work dresses, the nicest thing she owned, and asked James if she could accompany him to church. He looked surprised but pleased. "I was hoping you would want to go," he said. "I usually attend services, but I have been going alone since you got here. I did not want to make you uncomfortable by asking you to come if you were not ready." They rode into town together in the wagon, and Grace was very aware of the stares they received as they walked into the small church. James, seemingly oblivious or simply not caring, led her to a pew near the front and sat down beside her. Grace kept her eyes forward, her hands folded in her lap, and tried to focus on the service rather than the whispers she could hear behind her. After the service, James introduced her to several people, including the mayor and his wife, the doctor, and various other townsfolk. Some were warm in their greetings, others were merely polite, but no one was outright rude to her face. Grace supposed that was something. Martha Cunningham sought her out before they left, giving her a warm hug and an invitation to tea later in the week. "You did well today," Martha whispered. "Hold your head high, dear. You have nothing to be ashamed of." On the ride home, James was quiet until they were well out of town. Then he said, "I am sorry if that was difficult for you. Small towns can be unforgiving when it comes to gossip." "It was not so bad," Grace said, "and Martha Cunningham was very kind. She invited me to tea." "Martha is good people," James agreed. "She and her husband moved here about 5 years ago. They have always been friendly to me, even after Sarah died and I became something of a hermit." "You are not a hermit," Grace protested. "You go into town regularly and people seem to respect you." "Respect is not the same as friendship," James said. "After Sarah died, I pulled away from people. It was too painful to be around couples around happiness. It reminded me of everything I had lost. But lately, I have been feeling different, less alone." He glanced at Grace as he said this, and she felt her heart skip. Before she could think of how to respond, they arrived back at the ranch, and the moment passed. As summer began to fade into fall, Grace found herself falling into an easy rhythm with James. They worked together, ate meals together, and spent evenings on the porch talking as the sun set over the mountains in the distance. Grace had never felt so comfortable with another person, so able to be herself without fear of judgment or rejection. She also could not deny, at least not to herself, that her feelings for James had grown far beyond gratitude and respect. She was falling in love with him, if she had not already fallen completely. It was in the way her heart raced when he smiled at her, in how she found herself looking for excuses to be near him, in the dreams she was beginning to have about a future that seemed impossibly out of reach. James gave her no indication that he felt the same way. He was kind and respectful, treating her as he would any valued employee. Grace told herself this was for the best. He had loved his wife deeply, and it had only been 2 years since her death. He was not ready for another relationship, and even if he were, why would he choose someone like Grace? She was an orphan with nothing to offer, a woman he had taken in out of charity. The fact that he had given her work and a place to stay did not mean he saw her as anything more than someone who needed help. But despite her logical reasoning, Grace could not stop her heart from hoping. One evening in late September, Grace was finishing up in the stables when she heard raised voices coming from near the house. She hurried over to find James confronting John Sullivan and his 2 sons. Sullivan was red-faced and angry, jabbing his finger at James's chest. "You are a fool, Morrison," Sullivan was saying. "I am offering you good money for this land, more than it is worth. You should take it while the offer stands." "I have told you 100 times, Sullivan, I am not selling," James said, his voice dangerously calm. "Now get off my property." "You think you are so much better than everyone else," Sullivan sneered. "Living out here with your whore pretending to be respectable." Grace gasped, and Sullivan's attention snapped to her, his face twisted into an ugly grin. "There she is. Tell me, girl, what are you really doing to earn your keep? We all know what kind of work a woman like you is good for." "Shut your mouth," James said, his voice like ice, but Sullivan had apparently decided to push further. "I could use a woman around my place," Sullivan continued. "I would pay you better than Morrison here, and the work would be easier. All you would have to do is—" He never finished the sentence. James's fist connected with Sullivan's jaw with a crack that echoed across the yard. Sullivan went down hard, blood pouring from his split lip. His sons started forward, but Pete and Tommy appeared from the bunkhouse, both carrying rifles. "I think your daddy needs some help getting back on his horse," Pete said calmly. "Why do not you boys see to that?" Sullivan's sons helped their father to his feet. Sullivan spat blood onto the ground and glared at James. "You will regret that, Morrison, I promise you that." "Get off my land," James repeated, "and do not come back. If you do, I will not stop at one punch." After the Sullivans had ridden off, James turned to Grace, who was shaking despite her best efforts to appear calm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle now. "I am fine," Grace said. "James, I am so sorry. This is my fault." "If I were not here, do not," James interrupted, taking her shoulders gently. "Do not apologize for something that is not your fault. Sullivan is a bastard, and he has been looking for an excuse to cause trouble for years. This has nothing to do with you." "He called me terrible things," Grace whispered, feeling tears threaten, "and people are going to believe him." "I do not care what people believe," James said fiercely. "I know the truth. You are a good, decent woman who has worked harder than anyone I have ever met. You have brought life back to this ranch," and he stopped abruptly, as if he had been about to say something more but thought better of it. "And what?" Grace asked softly. James looked at her for a long moment, and Grace saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "And you have brought life back to me," he said finally. "I did not realize how much I had shut myself off from the world until you came here. These past months, having you here, talking with you, working alongside you, Grace, you have made me remember what it feels like to be happy again." Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "James," she began, but she did not know how to finish. "I know this is not the time or place," James said, releasing her shoulders and stepping back. "You have just been insulted and threatened, and I am standing here like a fool trying to say." He stopped again, running a hand through his hair in frustration. I am making a mess of this. Tell me, Grace said, moving closer to him. Please, James, say what you want to say. James met her eyes and Grace saw vulnerability there, a fear of being rejected or causing pain. I care about you, he said quietly. More than I should, probably. More than is wise, considering you work for me and are dependent on me for your livelihood, but I cannot seem to help it. These feelings have been growing for weeks, and I keep telling myself to ignore them, to be professional and appropriate. But when Sullivan said those things about you, when he threatened you, I realized that I do not just care about you. I am falling in love with you, Grace. Maybe I have already fallen. Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks, but for once they were happy tears. I am in love with you too, she said. I have been for weeks, but I was afraid to say anything. I thought you still loved Sarah, that you could never see me as anything but the desperate girl who begged you for work. I did love Sarah, James said. I always will, in a way. She was my first love, and losing her nearly destroyed me. But I have learned that the heart has room for more than one love, and what I feel for you is different but no less real. You are strong and brave and kind, and you have shown me that life can be good again. I know I have no right to ask this, given how we met and the circumstances, but Grace, could you see a future with me? Not as my employee, but as my partner, as my wife. Grace laughed through her tears and closed the distance between them, reaching up to cup his face with her hands. Yes, she said. Yes, James, I would be honored to be your wife. James pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if afraid she might disappear. When he finally pulled back enough to look at her face, he smiled, that rare, beautiful smile that transformed him. Then he lowered his head and kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning like fools, Pete's voice called out from near the bunkhouse. About damn time, boss. We were wondering when you two were going to figure it out. James laughed, a deep, genuine sound that Grace realized she had never heard from him before. I guess we were not as subtle as we thought, he said. Not even a little bit, Tommy added, grinning from beside Pete. But we are happy for you both. Real happy. The next few weeks passed in a blur of happiness for Grace. James courted her properly, despite the fact that she was already living in his house. He would bring her wildflowers he found on the property, would save the best pieces of meat for her at meals, would find excuses to hold her hand or steal kisses when they had moments alone. They decided to wait a few months before marrying, wanting to give people time to adjust to the idea and to let Grace have time to prepare properly. Martha Cunningham was delighted when she heard the news and took Grace under her wing, helping her plan the wedding and teaching her the finer points of running a household like the ranch. Other women in town, seeing Martha's approval and James's obvious happiness, began to warm to Grace as well. Not everyone, of course. Some people, particularly those friendly with the Sullivans, continued to gossip and disapprove. But Grace found she cared less and less what those people thought. She had James, she had friends like Martha, Pete, and Tommy, and she had a place where she belonged. John Sullivan made one more attempt to cause trouble. He went to the sheriff with accusations that James was keeping Grace against her will, that she was being forced to work without pay and other wild claims. The sheriff, a fair man named Bill Henderson, came out to the ranch to investigate. He talked to Grace privately, and she assured him that she was there of her own free will, that James treated her with nothing but respect, and that she was planning to marry him because she loved him, not because she felt obligated or coerced. Sheriff Henderson told Sullivan to leave the Morrisons alone or face charges for harassment. Sullivan backed off after that, though Grace knew he still harbored resentment toward James. She tried not to let it worry her. Some people would never be happy, no matter what happened around them. Grace and James were married on a cold December morning in 1878, 4 months after she had first arrived at the ranch. The wedding was held in the same small church where Grace had first attended services with James, and Martha Cunningham stood up as Grace's witness while Pete served as James's. Grace wore a dress she had sewn herself from the blue fabric James had given her, and she had never felt more beautiful or more loved than when she walked down the aisle and saw James waiting for her, his eyes full of love and wonder. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed Grace with such tenderness that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. After the service, Martha and her husband hosted a small reception at their home, and Grace was touched by how many people came to wish them well. She had gone from being an outsider to being accepted as one of them, and it meant more than she could express. That night, Grace and James finally shared the master bedroom together as husband and wife. James was gentle and patient with Grace, who had never been with a man before, and he took his time showing her all the ways that love could be expressed. Grace had known she loved him, but that night she fell even deeper, discovering layers of passion and tenderness she had not known existed. In the morning, wrapped in James's arms as the sun rose over the mountains, Grace thought about how much her life had changed in just 6 months. She had gone from desperate and alone to cherished and loved. She had a home, a husband, and a future full of promise. "What are you thinking about?" James murmured, his voice still rough with sleep. "How lucky I am," Grace said, turning in his arms to face him. "6 months ago, I was prepared to sleep in a stable and work for scraps of food. Now I am lying in the most comfortable bed I have ever known, married to the most wonderful man I have ever met, with a whole life ahead of us." "I am the lucky one," James said, kissing her forehead. "You brought light back into my life when I thought I would live in darkness forever. I love you, Grace Morrison." "I love you too," Grace whispered, and she kissed him, pouring all her happiness and gratitude and love into that kiss. The months that followed their marriage were some of the happiest of Grace's life. She and James worked the ranch together, true partners in every sense of the word. Pete and Tommy continued to work for them, and Grace thought of them as family. The ranch prospered, with James's horses gaining a reputation for quality that brought buyers from all over Colorado and beyond. Grace proved to be a natural with the horses, and James began teaching her more advanced training techniques. She had a gift for gentling difficult animals, and together they built a strong breeding program that would ensure the ranch's success for years to come. In the spring of 1879, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She told James one evening after supper, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment, he just stared at her, and Grace felt a flutter of worry. Did he not want children? Had they not discussed this enough? Then James whooped with joy, swept Grace up in his arms, and spun her around until she was laughing and dizzy. "We are going to have a baby," he kept repeating, wonder in his voice. "Grace, we are going to have a baby." "Yes, we are," Grace said, holding him tight. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it," James said, setting her down gently and placing a hand on her still flat stomach. "A child, our child, Grace, I never thought I would have this again. After Sarah died, I thought that dream died with her, but here you are, giving me more than I ever dared hope for." Grace's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. She continued to work on the ranch, though James became increasingly protective, insisting she avoid any heavy lifting or dangerous work. Grace found his protectiveness endearing, even when it was a bit excessive. Martha Cunningham visited regularly, bringing advice and supplies and generally mothering Grace in a way that filled a void she had not realized was still there. In October of 1879, Grace went into labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when both she and James were frightened. But Dr. Foster, the town physician, was skilled and patient, and Martha stayed by Grace's side throughout, offering encouragement and support. Finally, after nearly 18 hours of labor, Grace and James's first child was born. A boy, healthy and loud, with a thick head of dark hair like his father and what looked like it might be his mother's blue eyes. "A son," James whispered, holding the tiny baby with the kind of reverence usually reserved for holy objects. "Grace, we have a son. What should we name him?" Grace asked, exhausted but elated as she watched her husband cradle their child. "What about Thomas?" James suggested. "After my father, Thomas Morrison. Tom for short." "Thomas Morrison," Grace repeated, testing how it sounded. "I like it. Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world, little one." The next few years passed in a happy blur of family life. Thomas was a good baby who grew into an energetic, curious toddler. In the spring of 1881, Grace gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah, after James's first wife. It felt right to honor her memory that way, and Grace felt no jealousy about it. Sarah Morrison had been loved and deserved to be remembered. Their daughter would carry her name with pride. The ranch continued to thrive. James's reputation as a horse breeder grew, and he began to command premium prices for his stock. They were able to hire additional help, expanding their operations and making life a bit easier. Pete remained with them, now more friend than employee. And Tommy married a girl from town and brought her to live in an expanded bunkhouse that was more of a small house now. Grace had never been happier. She had a husband who adored her, 2 beautiful children, a home she loved, and work that fulfilled her. She had also gained the respect and friendship of most of Fort Lyon's residents. Even those who had initially disapproved of her relationship with James had come around once they saw how happy the couple was, and how hard Grace worked to be a good wife and mother. John Sullivan remained a distant problem. He never forgave James for refusing to sell and for humiliating him that day in the yard. He spread rumors when he could, and tried to interfere with James's business dealings when opportunities arose. But his influence was limited, and most people saw through his vindictiveness. James and Grace did their best to simply ignore him and go about their lives. In 1883, tragedy struck the Sullivan family when John's youngest son was killed in a riding accident. Despite everything Sullivan had said and done to them, Grace felt genuine sympathy for his loss. She convinced James to attend the funeral, and they paid their respects like good neighbors should. Sullivan seemed surprised by their presence but nodded his thanks. After that, the animosity between the families lessened, though they would never be friends. By 1885, Grace and James had 3 children. After Sarah came another boy they named Peter, after Pete, which made the old cowboy tear up with emotion when they told him. The house that had once seemed too large and too empty was now full of life and laughter, with toys scattered across floors and children's voices echoing through the rooms. Grace sometimes thought about that desperate girl who had walked up to James 7 years earlier, begging for work cleaning stables. She felt like a different person now, transformed by love and stability and purpose. She had learned that family was not just about blood relations, but about the people who chose to stand by you, to love you, to build a life alongside you. One evening in late summer, after the children were in bed, Grace and James sat on the porch as they often did, watching the sun set over the mountains. James had his arm around her shoulders and Grace was leaning against him, perfectly content. "You remember the day we met?" James asked suddenly. "Of course," Grace said. "I was terrified and desperate and trying so hard not to show it, and you were this tall, intimidating cowboy who I was sure would send me away." "I almost did," James admitted. "Not because I did not want to help, but because I was afraid. Afraid of letting someone new into my life, of opening myself up to that kind of pain again. But something about you made me take the risk. I am so glad I did." "So am I," Grace said softly. "You gave me everything that day, James, not just a job or a place to stay, but a future, a family, a home. You gave me your heart, and I promise I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of that gift." "You do not have to be worthy of it," James said, turning her face up to kiss her gently. "You already are. You always have been. I love you, Grace, more than I can ever say." "I love you too," Grace whispered against his lips. "Forever." As they sat there in the fading light, surrounded by the land they had built together and the life they had created, Grace sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. She had begged for work cleaning stables, expecting nothing more than basic survival. Instead, she had been given the master bedroom, a man's heart, and a love that would last a lifetime. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges. In 1887, a harsh winter tested the ranch's resources and stamina. Several cattle were lost, and there were days when Grace worried they might lose everything they had worked so hard to build. But James's careful planning and their combined determination saw them through, and by spring, they were recovering. Thomas grew into a responsible young boy who loved horses as much as his father did. By the age of 8, he was already showing a natural talent for training, and James spent hours working with him in the corrals, teaching him everything he knew. Sarah, named for the woman whose room she had never known, was a sweet-natured girl with her mother's compassion and her father's determination. Peter, the youngest, was a wild child who kept Grace constantly on her toes but made her laugh every single day. Martha Cunningham remained one of Grace's closest friends, and their families often had dinner together or attended church as a group. Pete eventually married a widow from town and moved into a small house they built on the edge of the Morrison property, staying on as foreman. Tommy and his wife had children of their own, and the ranch became a community of families all working together toward shared goals. Grace often thought about how different her life might have been if she had not walked up to James that day in August of 1878. What if he had turned her away? What if she had gone to a different town or asked someone else for work? The sliding doors of fate fascinated her, but she was grateful beyond measure for the path she had taken. In the summer of 1890, James surprised Grace by building her a garden behind the house. He had noticed how she admired the flowers in Martha's garden, and how she sometimes talked wistfully about her mother's vegetable patch back in Missouri. He wanted to give her a space of her own, something that was just for her pleasure and not related to the work of the ranch. Grace was moved to tears by the gesture. As she planted seeds and tended her flowers and vegetables, she felt a connection to her mother that she had not experienced in years. She wished her parents could have met James and known their grandchildren. They would have been so proud and so happy for her. One afternoon, as Grace was working in her garden while the children played nearby, she heard a rider approaching. Looking up, she was surprised to see John Sullivan, now much older and grayer than the angry man who had caused so much trouble years before. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron, suddenly wary. "Mrs. Morrison," Sullivan said, removing his hat. "I apologize for coming by unannounced." "Is your husband around?" "He is out checking the north fence," Grace said carefully. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Sullivan?" Sullivan shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "I actually came to speak with you if you have a moment." I know I have got no right to ask for your time, given how I have behaved over the years, but I would appreciate it if you would hear me out." Grace studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Would you like to come inside for some coffee?" "I would not say no to that," Sullivan admitted, dismounting. They settled at the kitchen table, and Grace poured coffee for them both while the children continued playing outside where she could see them through the window. Sullivan seemed to be struggling with what he wanted to say, turning his cup around in his hands without drinking. "I owe you and your husband an apology," Sullivan said finally. "A real one, not just words to be polite. I have been a jackass to you both for over a decade now, and it has been eating at me. Losing my boy, that changed something in me, made me realize that holding on to anger and resentment was poisoning my life and my relationships with everyone around me. My wife barely speaks to me anymore, and my remaining sons do not respect me. I can see now that I brought that on myself." Grace was quiet, letting him continue. "The truth is, I was jealous of James Morrison from the first day he moved here. He was younger than me, but he had vision and determination, and he built something impressive. Meanwhile, my ranch was struggling because I was too stubborn to change my ways or admit when I needed help. When he refused to sell to me, it felt like a personal insult. And then when you came along and I saw how happy you made him, it made me even angrier because it reminded me that my own marriage had become cold and distant." "That was not our fault," Grace said quietly. "James and I never did anything to hurt you or your family." "I know that," Sullivan said. "I know it, but I was not ready to admit it back then. I am hoping that now, even though it is too late to undo the harm I have caused, I can at least say I am sorry and mean it. You are good people, and you did not deserve the way I treated you." Grace took a sip of her coffee, considering his words. "I appreciate you saying this, Mr. Sullivan. I truly do. But you need to be saying it to James, not just to me. He is the one you struck at most directly." "I plan to," Sullivan assured her. "I wanted to start with you because what I said about you that day, when I called you those terrible names, that is something that has haunted me. You were just a young woman trying to survive, and I tried to destroy your reputation and hurt you in the cruelest way I could. That was unforgivable. And yet I am forgiving you anyway," Grace said, surprising herself. "Not because you deserve it necessarily, but because holding on to anger takes energy I would rather spend on my family and my life. I forgive you, Mr. Sullivan. I hope you can find peace with yourself and repair your relationships with your wife and sons. Life is too short to spend it being bitter and angry." Sullivan looked at her with something like wonder. "You are a remarkable woman, Mrs. Morrison. James is a lucky man." "I am the lucky one," Grace said, standing to indicate the conversation was over. "Now, if you want to speak with James, he should be back soon. You are welcome to wait for him if you would like." Sullivan did wait, and Grace watched from the window as he and James talked. The conversation seemed tense at first, but gradually both men relaxed. They did not shake hands or embrace, but when Sullivan left, there was a sense that old wounds had begun to heal. That night, after the children were asleep, James told Grace about his conversation with Sullivan. "He apologized," James said, still sounding slightly amazed. "Really apologized without making excuses. He also told me that if I ever need help, need an extra hand during a difficult time, to let him know. Said it would not make up for the past, but it would be a start." "People can change," Grace said. "Sometimes it takes a tragedy or hitting rock bottom, but people can change. I am glad he is trying, for his family's sake if nothing else." "You are too kind," James said, pulling her close. "That is one of the million things I love about you." As they settled into bed that night, Grace thought about forgiveness and second chances. She had been given a second chance at life when James hired her all those years ago. Perhaps John Sullivan deserved a second chance to be a better man. Time would tell whether he would make the most of it. The 1890s brought more changes to the Morrison family. Thomas, now a teenager, was becoming a skilled horseman and taking on more responsibility around the ranch. Sarah developed a love of books and learning, and Grace and James made arrangements for her to attend a better school in a larger town, though she would still live at home. Peter showed signs of having his father's business sense, always looking for ways to improve efficiency or save money. In 1893, Grace and James welcomed their fourth and final child, a daughter they named Martha, after the friend who had been so kind to Grace when she first arrived in Fort Lyon. Martha Cunningham was honored and delighted, serving as the baby's godmother and doting on her namesake every chance she got. The ranch had grown substantially over the years. What had started as James's modest operation now employed a dozen men and encompassed several thousand acres. They had built a reputation for quality horses that extended well beyond Colorado, and buyers came from as far as California and Texas to purchase Morrison stock. Despite their success and the wealth they had accumulated, Grace and James remained grounded and generous. They remembered what it was like to struggle, and they were always willing to help people who needed it. They employed veterans who were having trouble finding work, gave young men a chance to learn a trade, and supported various charities in Fort Lyon and the surrounding area. Grace sometimes hired young women who were in situations similar to what hers had been, giving them work and a safe place to stay until they could get on their feet. She never forgot what James's kindness had meant to her, and she tried to pay that forward whenever possible. James supported her in this completely, building a small cottage on the property where women could stay with privacy and dignity while they worked and saved money. In 1896, Thomas, now 17, fell in love with a girl from town named Elizabeth Harper. Grace could see in her son's eyes the same look James had once had when looking at her, and she gave her blessing when Thomas asked permission to court Elizabeth seriously. They were young, but Grace and James had been young too, and sometimes young love was the truest kind. Sarah, at 15, was excelling in her studies and talking about becoming a teacher. She had her mother's compassion and her father's intelligence, and Grace knew she would make a difference in whatever path she chose. Peter, at 13, was already helping his father with complex business decisions and negotiations. And little Martha, only 3 years old, was the baby of the family and thoroughly spoiled by everyone. One evening in the fall of 1897, Grace and James took a rare evening alone, riding out to a spot on their property that overlooked the entire ranch. They could see the house, the barns, the corrals, all of it bathed in the golden light of sunset. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of horses and the voices of men finishing up the day's work. "Can you believe all of this?" James asked, gesturing at the view. "Sometimes I look around and cannot quite believe how much our lives have changed." "I know what you mean," Grace said. "Sometimes I wake up and have to remind myself that this is real, that I am not going to wake up cold and hungry and alone somewhere." "You will never be alone again," James promised, taking her hand. "We have built something incredible here, Grace. And I am not just talking about the ranch or the business. I am talking about our family, our life together. None of this would exist without you." "We built it together," Grace corrected gently. "Everything we have, we created as partners." "Partners," James agreed, kissing her hand. "In everything. You know, when I gave you that master bedroom all those years ago, I never imagined that someday we would be sharing it as husband and wife. I just wanted to give you something good, something comfortable. I wanted to help you." "You gave me far more than a comfortable room," Grace said. "You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me a future when I could not see past the next day. You gave me love when I thought I would be alone forever. James Morrison, you gave me everything." "And you gave me back my life," James said seriously. "After Sarah died, I was just going through the motions, existing but not really living. You changed that. You made me want to wake up in the morning. You gave me a reason to hope and plan and dream again. You gave me a family and more happiness than I ever thought I would have again. Grace, you are the best thing that ever happened to me." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. Grace leaned against James, feeling his solid warmth, and thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had begged for work cleaning stables, expecting nothing more than a chance to survive another day. Instead, she had been given the master bedroom, a symbol of respect and care that she had not understood at the time. But more than that, so much more than that, she had been given James's heart, and that gift had transformed her life in ways she could never have imagined. As they rode back to the house as darkness fell, Grace thought about all the challenges they had overcome together. The gossip and judgment from town, the threats from Sullivan, the hard winters and difficult seasons, the normal struggles of building a life and raising a family. Through all of it, they had remained united, facing each challenge as partners and emerging stronger on the other side. The house was lit up when they arrived, warm and welcoming. They could hear the children inside, Thomas helping Sarah with her studies while Peter read to little Martha. Pete and his wife were having dinner in their cottage, and smoke rose from the chimneys of the various buildings scattered across the property. It looked like a painting, Grace thought, a picture of home and family and everything good in the world. That night, as Grace prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. She was 38 years old now, no longer the desperate 19-year-old girl who had walked up to James almost 20 years ago. There were fine lines around her eyes and a few strands of silver in her hair. Her hands were roughened from years of work, and her body showed the marks of bearing 4 children. But her eyes were bright and happy, and her face held the contentment of a woman who was deeply loved and who loved deeply in return. James came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder as they both looked at their reflection. "Still the most beautiful woman I have ever seen," he murmured. "You are biased," Grace said, but she was smiling. "Absolutely," James agreed. "But that does not make it any less true." As they settled into bed together, Grace thought about how this room, this beautiful master bedroom, had been a symbol of so much. Of loss, when James's first wife died here. Of hope, when he gave it to Grace as a sign that she mattered and was worth more than a space in the stable. Of new beginnings, when they began sharing it as husband and wife. Of family, as the sounds of their children growing up had echoed through its walls. "Thank you," Grace whispered into the darkness. "For what?" James asked sleepily, pulling her closer. "For everything," Grace said. "For taking a chance on a desperate girl begging for work. For seeing something in me that I did not see in myself, for loving me, for giving me this life. Grace Morrison, I would take that chance 1,000 times over," James said, his voice full of emotion. "You are my heart, my partner, my home. Thank you for saying yes all those years ago. Thank you for loving me back. Thank you for building this life with me." Grace turned in his arms and kissed him, a kiss that held nearly 20 years of love and partnership and shared experiences. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling in the darkness. "I love you," Grace said. "I love you too," James replied. "Always and forever." As Grace drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, in the master bedroom of the home they had built together, She sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for all the blessings in her life. She had traveled a long road from that dusty afternoon when she approached a tall cowboy and begged for work. But every step of that journey had been worth it, because it had led her here, to this moment, to this life, to this love. The years ahead would bring more changes and challenges, more joys and sorrows, as all lives do. But Grace and James would face them together, as they always had, partners in every sense of the word. In the spring of 1899, Thomas married Elizabeth Harper in a beautiful ceremony that reminded Grace very much of her own wedding over 20 years earlier. The young couple moved into a house James had built for them on the edge of the property, and Thomas took on even more responsibility for running the ranch. Grace saw so much of James in her eldest son, and so much of herself in the way Elizabeth looked at Thomas, with absolute love and devotion. Sarah, now 18, announced her intention to attend normal school to become a teacher. Grace and James fully supported her decision, proud of her ambition and intelligence. Peter, at 16, was already handling many of the business aspects of the ranch, showing a head for numbers and negotiations that impressed even his father. And Martha, now 6 years old, was showing signs of inheriting her father's way with horses, spending every free moment in the corrals. In 1900, the new century dawned, bringing with it a sense of possibility and change. Grace was 41 years old, James was 52, and they had been married for over 20 years. The ranch was thriving beyond anything they had imagined in those early days. They owned several thousand acres, employed dozens of men, and had a reputation that extended across the West. But more important than any material success was the family they had built and the love they shared. Grace looked at her children, now mostly grown, and felt a deep satisfaction. She and James had given them something neither of them had much of in their own childhoods: stability, security, love, and a place to call home. One afternoon, Grace was working in her garden when Martha Cunningham came to visit. Her dear friend was now in her 60s, moving a bit slower than she once had, but her spirit was as bright as ever. "I was just thinking about the day we met," Martha said as they sat together on the porch, watching little Martha play with a new puppy. "You were so young and so scared, trying so hard to be brave, and look at you now. Look at everything you have built." "I could not have done it without good people like you in my corner," Grace said, taking Martha's hand. "You gave me friendship when I desperately needed it. You helped me see that I deserved respect and kindness. I will never forget that." "You would have been fine without me," Martha said. "You have always had strength in you, Grace. You just needed someone to help you see it, but I am glad I could be that person. Watching you and James build this life together, raise your beautiful children, create something lasting, it has been one of the great joys of my life." As the afternoon wore on and Martha prepared to leave, Grace hugged her friend tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For being my friend, for standing by me, for helping me when I needed it most." "That is what friends do," Martha said simply. "We stand by each other, and Grace, you have done the same for so many others. All those young women you have helped over the years, giving them the same chance James gave you. That is a beautiful legacy." After Martha left, Grace thought about the idea of legacy. What would people remember about her life? She hoped they would remember her as someone who worked hard, who loved deeply, who helped others when she could. She hoped they would remember her as a good wife, a good mother, a good friend. But mostly, she hoped her children would remember that love could transform a life, that kindness mattered, that second chances were real. She hoped they would carry those lessons forward and build their own lives on those foundations. In 1902, Sarah became engaged to a young lawyer from Denver named Robert Mitchell. He was a good man who clearly adored Sarah and shared her passion for education and justice. Grace and James gave their blessing, and another wedding was planned. Peter, now 19, had fallen in love with a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, and everyone expected another engagement announcement soon. The family was growing, expanding, becoming something even larger than Grace and James had imagined. In 1903, Thomas and Elizabeth welcomed their first child, making Grace and James grandparents for the first time. The baby boy, named James after his grandfather, was doted on by everyone and brought a new kind of joy to the family. As Grace held her grandson for the first time, she thought about the circle of life, about how quickly time passed, and how precious every moment was. She remembered holding Thomas for the first time, remembered the overwhelming love and fear she had felt. Now Thomas was a father himself, beginning his own journey of parenthood. "He is perfect," Grace whispered to Elizabeth, who was resting after the delivery. "You did so well, and he is absolutely perfect." "Thank you, Mother Morrison," Elizabeth said, using the affectionate title she had adopted for Grace. "I hope I can be half the mother you have been to your children." "You will be wonderful," Grace assured her. "Motherhood is not about being perfect. It is about loving with your whole heart and doing the best you can. That is all any of us can do." James was equally enchanted with his grandson, holding the tiny baby with the same careful reverence he had shown with their own children. That evening, as they walked back to their house, leaving the new parents to bond with their baby, James took Grace's hand. "We have built something good here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A family that will continue long after we are gone. Children and grandchildren who will carry forward what we started. Grace, when I think about how close I came to missing all of this, how I could have turned you away that day, it terrifies me." "But you did not turn me away," Grace said softly. "You took a chance on a desperate girl and it changed both our lives. James, do you have any regrets about any of it?" "Not a single one," James said firmly. "Well, maybe I regret not kissing you sooner. I wasted months trying to be professional and appropriate when I should have just told you how I felt," Grace laughed. "We got there eventually, and maybe the waiting made it sweeter when it finally happened." "Maybe," James agreed. "But I still would have kissed you on day one if I had known you would kiss me back." They reached their house and stood on the porch for a moment, looking out at the ranch spread before them. The sun was setting, painting everything in gold and amber. In the distance, they could see lights coming on in various houses and buildings, each one representing people they cared about, people who were part of their extended family. "I am 65 years old," James said suddenly. "I have been thinking about slowing down a bit, letting Thomas take over more of the daily operations. I want to spend more time with you, with the grandchildren. I want to enjoy what we have built instead of always working to build more." "I think that sounds perfect," Grace said. "We have earned the right to slow down and enjoy our lives. Thomas is more than capable of running things, and we will still be here if he needs advice or help. But yes, let us take some time for ourselves. Travel a bit, visit Sarah in Denver, just enjoy being together." Over the next few years, James and Grace did exactly that. They turned over most of the daily operations of the ranch to Thomas while remaining involved in big decisions. They traveled to Denver to visit Sarah and her growing family, took a trip to San Francisco that Grace had always dreamed of, and simply spent time together enjoying the life they had built. Martha, their youngest, grew into a confident young woman who had no interest in traditional feminine pursuits. She wanted to work the ranch, to train horses, to be involved in the family business just like her brothers had been. Grace and James supported her completely, even when others in town thought it was inappropriate for a young woman. "Let them talk," James said, when someone made a comment about Martha's unusual interests. "She is my daughter, and she can pursue whatever dreams she wants. If she wants to train horses, then she will train horses, and she will be damn good at it." Martha proved him right, showing a natural talent that even surpassed her brother's. By the time she was 18, she was handling some of the most difficult horses on the ranch and earning respect from even the most traditional cowboys. In 1910, Pete passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78. His death hit both Grace and James hard. He had been with them from the beginning, had stood by them through every challenge, and had become far more than an employee. He was family, and his loss left a hole in their lives. At Pete's funeral, Grace spoke about the kind of man he had been. "Pete taught me that family is not just about blood," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "It is about the people who stand beside you, who support you, who care about you. Pete was family to us, and he will be deeply missed. But his legacy lives on in this ranch, in the lives he touched, in the example he set. We were blessed to know him, and we will honor his memory by continuing to live the way he taught us, with integrity, hard work, and kindness." James squeezed her hand as she sat down, and Grace leaned against him, drawing comfort from his presence as she always had. They were both getting older now. Grace was 51, James was 62, and they could feel the years in ways they had not before. But they still had each other, and they still had the family and life they had built together. In 1912, Martha announced her engagement to a young rancher named David Foster, who shared her love of horses and had no problem with her unconventional ways. The wedding was small but joyful, and Grace was happy to see all 4 of her children settled with partners who loved them and shared their values. By 1915, Grace and James had 7 grandchildren, with more on the way. The ranch was thriving under Thomas's leadership, with Peter handling the business side and Martha training horses that were sought after across the West. Sarah was living in Denver, where her husband had a successful law practice, and she was teaching at a school for girls, making a difference in young lives just as she had always wanted. One evening in the fall of that year, Grace and James sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Grace was 56 now, James was 67, and they had been married for 37 years. The master bedroom they shared had witnessed decades of love, joy, sorrow, and every emotion in between. "You remember what you told me the day we met?" James asked suddenly. "I told you a lot of things that day," Grace said with a smile. "I was desperate and probably talked too much trying to convince you to hire me. You said you were a hard worker, and you were not afraid of labor," James recalled. "You said you just needed a little food and a corner to sleep. You were asking for so little, and I ended up giving you the master bedroom. You gave me so much more than a room," Grace said, taking his hand. "You gave me a life, James. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," James corrected. "You saved me just as much as I saved you, Grace. Maybe more. I was drowning in grief and loneliness, and you pulled me back to the world. You gave me a reason to live again, a reason to hope and dream. Everything good in my life for the past 37 years has been because of you." Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks, happy tears that came from a heart so full of love it could barely contain it. "I love you, James Morrison. I have loved you since I first understood what real love was, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you, Grace Morrison," James said, wiping away her tears gently. "In this life and whatever comes after, you will always be my heart." They sat together as the stars came out, holding hands and watching the night settle over the ranch they had built together. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of their family, their children and grandchildren, all the life they had created. It was a symphony of joy and love, and Grace thought it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows as all years do. James's health began to decline as he entered his 70s, and Grace devoted herself to caring for him just as she had devoted herself to everything else in their life together. He remained alert and engaged, delighting in his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but his body was slowing down. In the spring of 1920, James passed away peacefully in his sleep, with Grace holding his hand. He was 72 years old, and they had been married for 42 years. Grace's heart broke with his loss, but she also felt profound gratitude for the decades they had shared, for the love that had defined her life, for everything he had given her. At his funeral, Grace stood and spoke about the man she had loved for more than half her life. James Morrison was many things, she said, her voice strong despite her grief. He was a rancher, a businessman, a father and grandfather, but most importantly, he was kind. When I came to him 42 years ago, desperate and alone, he could have turned me away or taken advantage of my situation. Instead, he gave me dignity and respect. He gave me the master bedroom and, eventually, his heart. Everything good in my life came from his kindness that day. He taught me that love can transform everything, that second chances are real, that one act of generosity can change a life. I will miss him every day for the rest of my life, but I will also be grateful every day that I got to love him and be loved by him. He was the best man I have ever known, and I am blessed to have been his wife. Grace lived for another 15 years after James's passing, remaining active in the ranch and in the lives of her children and grandchildren. She continued to help young women who needed a chance, just as James had helped her, seeing it as a way to honor his memory and his legacy of kindness. She often visited James's grave, sitting beside the stone and talking to him as if he were still there. She told him about the grandchildren, about the ranch, about everything that was happening in the family he had loved so much. She missed him terribly, but she never regretted their life together. It had been everything she could have hoped for and more. On a warm summer evening in 1935, Grace passed away peacefully in her sleep, in the master bedroom that had played such an important role in her life story. She was 76 years old. Her children and grandchildren gathered to lay her to rest beside James, and they spoke of her strength, her kindness, her unwavering love for her family and her husband. Thomas, now in his 50s, stood at his mother's grave and told the story one more time, the story that had become family legend. "My mother came to this ranch with nothing but hope and determination," he said. "She begged for work cleaning stables, and my father gave her the master bedroom and his heart. Their love story was one for the ages, a testament to the power of kindness, second chances, and true partnership. They built something remarkable together, not just a successful ranch, but a family, a legacy, and an example of how to love fully and live well. We are all here because of their love, and we will carry their lessons forward into the future." The Morrison Ranch continued to thrive for generations, passed down through Thomas's line, and remaining one of the most respected horse ranches in Colorado. But more important than any business success was the story that was told and retold, of a desperate young woman and a kind cowboy, of a chance taken, and a love that changed everything. Grace Reeves Morrison had begged for work cleaning stables, expecting only the bare minimum needed to survive. Instead, James Morrison had given her the master bedroom, a symbol of respect and care. But more than that, he had given her his heart, and in return, she had given him hers. Together, they had built a life that was rich in love, family, and joy, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures come from the simplest acts of kindness. And in the end, that was the legacy they left behind. Not just land or horses or a successful business, but the knowledge that one moment of compassion could change everything, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, and that home was not a place, but the people you chose to share your life with. Grace and James had found their home in each other, and that home had been built on a foundation of kindness, respect, and enduring love that lasted until their final days and beyond.